All right, congratulations. You made it to the very last theoretical video. This will be the last of the extremely new beginner to C Sharp coding series where I'm explaining concepts using simple theoretical examples. In subsequent videos, we're going to be coding in Visual Studio. If you don't already know how to install Visual Studio, please watch the video linked above and it will give you a cue as to what you should do to get installed and get set up. Because in the next video, we're going to be making a Revit application. So today, we're going to be looking at methods, enumerations, and a few other interesting things that we'll surely encounter as we code with C Sharp for Revit. So let's get started. Okay, so first thing we want to look at today is methods. A method is how you perform something in coding. Typically, when you think about coding programming as object oriented, meaning that everything is an object, a method is how you would get that object to perform a function. So in previous videos, I've given examples like asking a car to drive or asking a person to sit down. That would be considered a method. But today we're going to be looking at methods in the context of C Sharp. So in C Sharp, every executed instruction is performed in the context of a method. A method is a code block that contains a series of statements. So it's usually predefined when you're creating a class for the first time. So let's say you're creating an object for a person and you're creating a class for how the person sits or stands. You would define what that method of sitting means. So when I say sit, find a chair and sit down. And when I say stand, support yourself and pull yourself up to be in an upright position. That would be me describing what that method should do when I'm creating the class. And so later on in my code, when I say person.sit or person.stand, then they are able to just perform the function because I've already said what that function means. So it's usually predefined and it's called on later during programming. Finally, it's usually something where you can pass more parameters into it. So you can define a method of, say, sit or stand, and then pass a parameter of on a chair, on a bed, in a car. You can tell it to have more instructions within what you've already defined. So let's look at an example of that. The syntax for methods in C Sharp is that you would firstly, you know that in C Sharp, we have to always call the data type that we are creating. So if I'm trying to create, for example, a method for a new subscriber and I want the person to subscribe to this channel, for example. So the class I'm creating is a person, hypothetically, and the person is a subscriber. And I'm saying new subscriber um, is the method I want the person to have. So I want the person to subscribe to the channel. And I'm passing a parameter into the subscriber to say that a new subscriber is a rock star because that's what they are. They are the people who keep this channel going. So on that note, please subscribe if you haven't already. This helps me a lot and tells me that you want to see more of these videos. With method overloading, multiple methods can have the same name with different parameters. So let's use a more concrete example in this case. Let's say we're creating a method for a window, right? We can have it as a window that is by wall host or a window that is by height and width. With overloading in C Sharp, you can have the same method name have different parameters. So you will see this when we start coding is if I want to make something, there are more than one ways to make it. This is called overloading. So just because someone chooses to make their window in C Sharp by wall host doesn't mean that I can't also go and make the same window by height and width. So when I call on the method window, typically a window should be a class, but you get the example. When I call on the method window, I have the options of which parameters of that window I want to leverage to create the window. This is something you would see a lot of when we start coding is we will choose different set of parameters depending on what we have available and depending on what we're trying to do. If you've already been coding with Dynamo, you already know that this is something that you have the option of creating, let's say, a rectangle by points or a rectangle by area or a rectangle by width height. These are parameters, and the method of creation of those parameters in methods in C Sharp is called overloading. So now that we've learned a little bit about the properties of methods, let's learn about the types of methods. There are several kinds of methods actually, but we're going to be focusing on just three because these are the most repetitive three we will encounter when we're coding for Revit. The first one is a constructor method, and it is instantiated with the new keyword. So every time in my code that you've seen something start with new, that's a constructor method, and it means I'm creating it for the first time. So I'm trying to create a method window, and I say new window. So we'll get to see this in practice. I think it's not something that conveys itself properly when you are learning in theory. But every single time you see the new keyword that we're creating something for the first time, that is a constructor method and it's used to create a new instance of a class or an object. So we're creating a window, an instance of a class window for the first time, we would say new. We're creating an instance of a wall for the first time, we would say new. But if we've already created it, we can simply call on the variable window when we want to use it in any line of code below. So the first time it's appearing in the code, we say new. Subsequently, we just call on the variable. Then you have static methods. These are already defined in a class, but you don't need to create a new object to use them. So unlike the last one where we had to say new before we could access the method for the first time in our code, this one is already defined. You don't need to add anything to it. You don't need to sort of pass any new definitions into it. So you would just add it. It's usually something that's like an attribute of a class. It's usually a method for this purpose is usually something where you don't actually need to create a new object or instantiate a new object. You're just calling on a property that can work on it. So for example, window.count. I don't need to say window equals new count because a count is not an instance of an object that I'm trying to create. A count is like a function that I want to have for my windows. I just want to have a total number of windows. That's a method that doesn't need to be instantiated. It's already predefined in the class that when I say count, give me the total number of windows, and that's what this will do for us. So this is one example. We'll get to see a lot more. So whenever you see a method that's called on without the new keyword, it's typically a static method. And finally, we have object methods, which is where it allows the object to perform some form of action. So the static method is more like an attribute, it's more like some kind of behavior that the object has. The object method is something the object does, right? So the constructor method makes a new instance of a class or an object. The static method calls on some kind of attribute that is already predefined that the object can perform. And then the object method allows it to do something that is kind of more active. Again, I know it sounds confusing in theory. It's going to be a lot clearer when we start coding, I promise you. But that's kind of the difference between the static and the object method. I'll do my best to point them out when we start coding if we are using a static method or an object method. Okay, so we've learned a bit about methods. We're going to cover just a few more things that I think are important to know for coding in terms of theory before we start coding. So enums are something that are quite repetitive in C# coding. An enum is short for enumeration, and it's a special data type that represents a group of constants. Enumeration means specifically listed. So it's like creating unchangeable read-only variables. You're creating a list of variables that cannot be changed. And this is the syntax. You can see it's kind of similar to how we would make a list or an array, but an enum is different because each value has a number associated. So when you have a list of values in an enum, they are already assigned a series of numbers. So Sunday is 0, Monday is 1, Tuesday is 2, and so on and so forth. And these numbers can be called on in your code to access this variable. So you don't always have to say Sunday or Monday. You can say 0 or 1, and you're able to access the variable inside your enum. It gets clearer when we start coding, of course, but think of it like an array of variables where each variable is assigned an integer value. So in a typical array, we would probably just have a list of values, but in an enum, you would have a list of variables, and each of those variables is assigned a fixed value. You can actually reassign the values that you want. So if you don't want it to be, for example, 0, 1, 2, 3, you want it to be 10, 11, 12, you can do that, but it's usually fixed and unchangeable. So you would do this when you don't want someone mistakenly overriding the data that you've created in your list of variables. Awesome. So let's learn about a few more concepts and we're ready to be on our way to be professional coders. So the concept of public and private, when we start coding, you see this a lot where a line of code is declared using the public keyword or the private keyword. For those who've already been learning programming, it's pretty clear, but basically you can define how you want people to access parts of your code by declaring it as public or as private. So a public member, I can access it in other classes. So let's say I have a solution and I have 4 classes and I defined something publicly in one of them. I can call on that thing in any of the other 3 classes. But if I make it private, it can only be accessed in that same class. So I can't call on it in a different class. So let me give you an example. By default, fields, properties, and methods are private and classes are public. This is the default setting, but you can actually declare what you want, public or private, as you feel. So look at this line of code as a very small example. This is not a series of classes. This is just a line of code with a variable speech. So greeting is a variable inside of the class speech. It's a string and it's containing the content of greetings. So if I want to access this variable greeting, I can only access it inside of the class speech. I can't create another class, let's say singing, and access greeting. However, because the class speech is public, if I create another class that's methods of communication, for example, something broader, I can reach back in and access speech because it's public. Really, it's just that when something is public, you can access it from anywhere. And when something is private, you can only access it from where you are at that current moment. I hope that clarifies. Finally, let's learn about interface. So this is something that you will find often in C# Revit coding. An interface is like a half implemented class. So there's something called abstraction in programming, which is where you hide certain details and show only essential information to the user. So abstraction is what the interface does to a class. You kind of take away a lot of the methods and properties that are not needed and show only what's needed. So usually you would have the new keyword on a class, but you wouldn't be able to use it on an interface because it's not a full class, it's like a half class. So this example I found on Stack Overflow is that a class is like a blueprint with what you can use to create new objects, but an interface is more like a contract that the class has to define what that blueprint should contain. So if the class is creating a plan, the interface is creating a contract that defines what that plan should show. I hope that explains it better. So usually you have a list class, but an iList is an interface. So you would see a couple of these where you see an I in front of the name of the data type, and that's usually an interface. It's quite common in C# coding. We have iExternal command, iExternal application, iList. These are abstracted forms of the original class, and they just define the contract that defines how we would create that class. Are you confused? Don't worry. Trust me, it gets easier when we start coding. But just knowing about this makes it less daunting when you see it for the first time in Visual Studio. So for example, when we want to implement an interface, you would use the colon symbol. So you've probably seen this a lot. You declare your class public, which means it can be accessed from anywhere in your code. You give the name of your class and you access the external command interface using the colon. I think this is a great place to stop because this code is something we'll be seeing a lot more of when we start coding in Visual Studio. Thank you so much for watching. You've been a great sport. I hope you've enjoyed the beginner series. And I know that you might be confused still about some of the concepts. Trust me, it gets clear when we start coding. Don't worry too much about it. And one more thing is if you do see a concept when we are actually coding that wasn't covered in any of these videos, I wouldn't worry too much, okay? It would be a bit too boring if I tried to cover every single concept before we actually start coding. It's kind of like trying to learn a new language and trying to learn every single word in the dictionary first. You would be extremely confused and probably discouraged from learning. So I hope I've given you just enough that when we start talking about classes and variables and interfaces and enums, it doesn't sound like Greek anymore. At least you have some idea of what it is. Maybe it's not too clear. That's okay. But the point of these videos is that when we start coding now, we're going to just call things what they are. This is a class, this is a list, this is an interface, and I hope that you know what they are. Thank you so much for sticking around. You are really a rock star for subscribing. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe. It really, really helps. Leave a comment if there's something else you'd like to see. I'll see you in the next video where we'll be making an external application. Thank you so much. You're the best. Till next time. Bye.